Well, welcome to Meck's online campus. I read an interesting book several years ago about the nature of novels, writing, fiction, stories. It was written by a guy named Christopher Booker, and it was titled The Seven Basic Plots. The premise of the book was exactly that. There are seven basic plots, seven basic stories that we tend to tell as a human race. And he went through what those seven were, gave examples of them, and it was just a fascinating read. Anyway, let me walk you through the seven. The first was overcoming the monster, is what he called it. So think about the plot of a movie like Jaws. The second was rags to riches, the classic Cinderella story. The third category he had was the quest, and for that you can think of something like The Lord of the Rings. A fourth type of story was Voyage and Return, which you find in something like The Wizard of Oz by Frank Baum. A fifth type is comedy, which obviously is anything designed to make you laugh, but it can be different kinds of humor, different types of comedies. It could be as sophisticated as the plays by the Greek playwright Aristophanes or the work of Jim Abrahams, who just passed away. I'm not smiling at him passing away. I'm smiling at the kinds of comedy that he did. He wrote and directed such movies as Airplane, The Naked Gun, with such classic lines as, "Surely you can't be serious," with the reply, "I am serious, and don't call me Shirley." A sixth type is tragedy, typically when one or more characters in the story dies at the end, but not just any death, a death that was violent, that was premature, that was unnatural, a death reflecting that something really had gone tragically wrong. So think about everything from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar or Antony and Cleopatra to a film like Bonnie and Clyde. And then finally, you have what Booker calls the rebirth story, which you find in a lot of children's tales. And I remember when I read this part of the book, I thought, I hadn't really thought about it quite this way, but how heavy a theme rebirth is in the children's folk tales. A hero or heroine falls under a dark spell that traps them. Then a miraculous act of redemption takes place, and they're liberated from darkness to light. So think Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, or even Charles Dickens' character Scrooge and what happens in A Christmas Carol. What if I told you there are not only seven basic stories in works of fiction, but there are seven basic plots when it comes to doubt as well? That there are seven main causes or stories behind it that we could explore. Let me tip my hat at the beginning to the work of Os Guinness on this, who wrote about these seven in his book, In Two Minds. And as we walk through each one, I think you'll find your story in one or more of these stories, because we all have doubts. We've all had seasons where we were doubters. As we talked about last week when we kicked off this series, doubt is not something to be ashamed of or awkward about. Doubt is not disbelief. Instead, it's about being in two minds. Guinness writes that to believe is to be in one mind about accepting something as true. To disbelieve is to be in one mind about rejecting it. To doubt is to waver between the two. To believe and to disbelieve at once, and so to be in two minds. And while doubt is not benign, it can lead to the erosion of faith or prevent someone from coming to faith. At its best, it leads to the evaluation of faith, the strengthening of faith. So while the Bible encourages us to address our doubts and grow in our faith, get answers to them and move beyond it, it's also very sympathetic to those who are wrestling with it, which is why you find both sides of that coin in the scriptures. For example, you find the Apostle James writing, "If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt." And then you also have, on the other hand, the Apostle Jude writing, "Be merciful to those who doubt." So let's look at the seven reasons we can doubt. And as we do, talk a bit as we go along about what we might do in response to each one of them. Okay, the first family of doubt has to do with doubt from ingratitude. And it may not seem at first like we're talking about gratitude or ingratitude. Let me see if we can unpack this. In other words, these doubters forget what their life was like before God, how much they needed Him, how much He changed them. And the more they forget, the less grateful they are. When someone comes to faith in God, it is often accompanied by this acute sense of need, of being in trouble, of needing, wanting to be saved. And that sets a good foundation. You know only too well who you were and the need for God you had in your life. But then time passes and our memory can fade. And we forget who we were apart from God, and that changes our heart. We slowly stop feeling the need for God. At this stage, all it takes is just a little push, an inconvenience, a little price to pay for faith, some obligation or embarrassment involved in being a Christian. And suddenly you find yourself saying, maybe I'm not so sure about all this after all. Perhaps I took this all a little too seriously. And the big idea behind these doubts is when you begin to look back on your life and see your coming to God as a phase you went through or a period you went through, as if now you're at a point where God is no longer needed or you're looking at things differently. The bottom line, though, really is ingratitude, an insensitivity to the reality of what we once were and now would now be apart from God. Sooner or later, this expresses itself in doubt. So how do you address this? Well, it's simple. Don't dry off. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Nothing is more moving, more meaningful, more inspiring, more invigorating to me than a baptism. A life that has been changed emerges from the waters, publicly confessing Jesus as forgiver and leader. They are forever marked and changed. I mean, their marriage will never be the same. Their parenting will never be the same. Their self-esteem, sense of purpose, value system, code of conduct, investment in community, sense of vocation and calling, never the same. And most of all, their eternity, never the same. Yet some people can forget. Some people dry off from their baptism. Or as Jesus once said, you have forsaken the love you had at first. Consider how far you have fallen. The more you dry off from your baptism, the more you are opening yourself up to doubts that are not really rooted in reality, but in a lack of gratitude. The seedbed, the instigation of it is a failure to remember. Well, the second type of doubt is doubt from a faulty view of God. A distorted picture of God, a wrong understanding of God, and that can create a seedbed for doubt. Let's say you have a view of God as some kind of celestial Santa Claus, the big grandfather of the sky who smiles at everything you do and pats us on the head while he's giving us whatever it is we want. This is a God who is safe and comfortable and convenient and warm and fuzzy. He serves all of our needs and then leaves us alone when we don't want to bother with him. Okay, if that's your view of God, what's going to happen if and arguably when your world is rocked by tragedy? When a crisis comes, when the diagnosis is cancer, when you get the news that a loved one has passed, when your home is destroyed by fire, along with everything in it, a lifetime of accumulations and memories, how is that going to affect your faith? What kind of doubts will arise? Particularly since there's no place in your view of God for that. Now compare that to what if there was a healthy view of God. David Ireland, diagnosed with a crippling neurological disease that would eventually take his life, was frequently asked, do you believe God will heal you? And he would respond with a question of his own. He would say, well, do I really need to be healed? In his book, Letters to an Unborn Child, Ireland explained his thinking. He said, I'm firmly convinced that God is extremely good and that he does love and understand all the world and all the people in it. Does he want to heal me? I can't even answer that. My faith is in the genuineness of God, not in whether he will do this or that to demonstrate his goodness. That's not the nature of my relationship to God. He didn't have a Santa Claus God. He had God as God. And when you have a clear picture, a true understanding of who God is and who we are in relation to him, it keeps a lot of doubts from ever even taking root, which is why the best advice someone dealing with this kind of doubt can get is found in a single verse from the Bible's collection of Psalms, where it simply says, be still and know that I am God. That means take time to reflect on God, who he is, what he's done, his nature, his character, and let that reflection speak to the deepest parts of who you are and how you think and how you feel. Well, a third story related to doubt is when you doubt from weak foundations. This doubt arises when you have no real reasons for your faith. You haven't built it on anything. You believe, but you'd be hard-pressed to say why you believe. Then when you run up against a challenge, a question, your faith just falls apart. Just think about how this can play out in the life of a typical college student. According to recent studies, almost half of all American college students will abandon their Christian faith during their undergraduate years. They will radically deconstruct to the point of having no faith whatsoever. 1 out of every 2, half. And you know why? It's really no secret. It's because they were never introduced to the answers to the questions being posed that challenged their faith. They weren't prepared for it. They weren't grounded in their faith. I once wrote in one of my books about my oldest daughter's experience as a freshman at one of the leading public universities in the United States. I don't want to name it, but its initials were the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. At the onset of her freshman year, in her first history course, her professor took it upon himself to announce that the entire historical record upon which Christianity is based is untrue, that Jesus never claimed to be the Messiah, that none of his followers saw him as divine until centuries after his death, that none of the Gospels were first-hand eyewitness accounts, that Jesus was not a religious figure as much as a political one, that there was never an intent to form any kind of church, that there were dozens of Gospels floating around, all of which were thought to be sacred by the followers of the Jesus movement and contradicted each other, and the 4 Gospels in the Bible today are filled with discrepancies and errors. Wow. First day, first course, first lecture. Nothing, he said, by the way, would stand up in an academic debate with a seminary professor who has devoted their life to the study of these things. But professors like that are on a mission. They want to destroy the faith of fragile freshmen behind the facade of pseudo-scholarship. They're more interested in indoctrinating than they are educating. I'll never forget my daughter calling me immediately after emerging from that first class, shaken by the vigorous assault on her faith. But instead of being riddled with doubts she never had before, she was able to engage it head on because of years of reading and instruction that had enabled her to know how baseless the professor's claims were. She wasn't hearing some of that stuff for the first time. She'd heard it before and knew exactly how, again, baseless it was. What broke her heart was the 300 other students in the class who sat passively, taking notes, accepting the professor's statements uncritically as fact. If you don't know why you believe what you believe, if you're taking a Sunday school level of faith into the teeth of intellectual predators, your faith will be riddled with bullets. This is why we read these words in the Bible. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. And that word reason is the Greek word apologia, where we get the term apologetics or the field of apologetics. The study of apologetics is the study of the reasons for faith. And we have entire courses on apologetics through the Meck Institute that you can take. But if you don't have that base, what happens? I mean, you can play it out. You hit college, you hear your faith intellectually engaged for the first time at the hands of an aggressive skeptic. Then when you hear that person in a position of power and influence and with lots of letters after their name assault you with half-baked ideas and spurious history, you don't say, oh, I know about this. It's not true. It's not even academically sound. I've thought this one through, checked it out. I've done the research and I know it's not what I believe. No. Instead, you say, why haven't I heard this before? I wonder what else they never told me. So there's doubt from ingratitude or a poor memory, doubt from a faulty view of God, doubt from a weak foundation or understanding of knowing why you believe what you believe, the reasons to believe. Then fourth, there's doubt from a lack of commitment. Doubt arises because there was no real commitment at the start, no real depth to conviction. It's as if God never really was your God. You never really settled it. What faith or belief you had was more like a wave on the ocean rather than an anchor in the ocean. When that's the case, then you're highly influenced by those around you, your circle of friends, your cultural context, the world in which you have placed yourself, as opposed to personal conviction. In that kind of setting, doubts are not a possibility. They are an inevitability. And not just doubts, but just having whatever faith you thought you had become meaningless or superficial or easily discarded or irrelevant. And when that happens, you end up faulting what you believed rather than how you believed. But the real issue was how you believed. It was really not much of a depth of belief at all. To avoid this, you've just got to settle who God is to you. He must become your God. And that's a very defining moment in any life. There was a pivotal moment in the history of the people of Israel on this. They needed to choose, and Joshua, their leader, brought the challenge. It's a stirring read. And so let me take a moment and just let the whole story be told. Follow along with this. This is something. Joshua said, "So now fear God. Worship him in total commitment. Get rid of the gods your ancestors worshipped on the far side of the river, the Euphrates, and in Egypt. You worship God. If you decide that it's a bad thing to worship God, then choose a God you'd rather serve. And do it today. Choose one of the gods your ancestors worshiped from the country beyond the river, or one of the gods of the Amorites, or on whose land you're now living. As for me and my family," Joshua said, "we will worship God." The people answered, "We'd never forsake God. Never. We'd never leave God to worship other gods. God is our God. He brought up our ancestors from Egypt and from slave conditions. He did all those great signs while we watched. He has kept his eye on us all along the roads we've traveled and among the nations that we have passed through. Just for us, he drove out all the nations, Amorites and all who lived in the land. Count us in. We too are going to worship God. He's our God." Then Joshua told the people, "You can't do it. You're not able to worship God. He's a holy God. He's a jealous God. He won't put up with your fooling around and sinning. When you leave God and take up the worship of foreign gods, he'll turn right around and come down on you hard. He'll put an end to you and after all the good he has done for you." But the people told Joshua, "No, we worship God." And so Joshua addressed the people. "You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen God for yourselves to worship him." And they said, "We are witnesses." Joshua said, "Now get rid of all the foreign gods you have with you. Say an unqualified yes to God, the God of Israel." The people answered Joshua, "We will worship God. What he says we'll do." And it's that kind of commitment, a burn the ships mentality, that is needed. But many people have never had. Which brings us to our fifth type of doubt, the doubt that comes from a lack of growth. Guinness writes that people do not lose their faith so much as they choose to stop using their faith. And when they do, they often begin doubting the faith they had. And then they blame faith for the doubt. But that wasn't the problem. Think of it like riding a bicycle. It's like someone who stops pedaling. And because the bike then comes to a stop, they said they couldn't help but fall off the bike. But they didn't have to fall off. They could have kept pedaling. C.S. Lewis once commented that if you were to interview 100 people who had lost their faith in Christianity, he said, how many would have been reasoned out of it by honest arguments, and how many just drifted away? His point was most just drift, which is why there's so much truth in the idea that if God feels distant, guess who moved? And when you move away from God, you invite doubts in. And when they are not rooted, and those doubts are not rooted in reality, but they're rooted in, quite frankly, a distant relationship with God. So let me just ask you some growth questions. You might be sitting there saying, well, I do have doubts, and you're not sure whether it's a growth issue or not. Let me just ask you some questions. If someone were to ask you where you are growing spiritually, or what you are discovering new about God, would you have a ready answer? Do you feel close to God? Or is he more concept than friend, more idea than father? Right now, are you more comfortable talking about him as an idea or theological category than you are talking about your personal relationship with him? How often do you think about or consider God's presence throughout the day? How are your spiritual reserves? I mean, if there was a gauge on your spiritual gas tank, how would it read right now? Full? Half empty? Or has the yellow light been on for a while, letting you know you're running on fumes? How do you handle crisis or failure, suffering or inconvenience or loneliness? You may publicly worship God, but when was the last time you privately worshiped him? Are you particularly troubled or convicted by behaviors and attitudes that you know to be sin? Do you ask for forgiveness, but you're not particularly interested in repentance? When was the last time you felt a specific prompting come to you from God in a counterintuitive way, directly as a result of time spent alone with him, and then you followed through on it? If someone were to ask you if you were more like Jesus today than you were a year ago or even 3 years ago, what would your honest answer have to be? Now, these questions are not meant to shame you. These are questions I ask myself. They are questions meant to wake us up if we've drifted asleep. You know, when I was thinking about this, I was brought to mind the words of Jesus from John's biography. Let me read these to you. Jesus said, "Live in me. Make your home in me, just as I do in you. In the same way that a branch can't bear grapes by itself, but only by being joined to the vine, you can't bear fruit unless you're joined with me. I am the vine. You are the branches. When you're joined with me and I with you, the relation intimate and organic, the harvest is sure to be abundant. Separated, you can't produce a thing. Anyone who separates from me is dead wood, gathered up and thrown on the bonfire." Well, here's a sixth way that your life can invite doubt, and that's when you doubt as a result of unruly emotions. Let's say the obvious. Emotions can overrun reason and faith. Fear, anger, desire, these are powerful forces. And left unchecked, emotions can dictate almost anything to your life, dictate your thinking, your actions, your decision-making. But here's what we forget. Emotions can't be trusted. Emotions are meant to be subject to reason. I mentioned C.S. Lewis earlier. He once gave the following counsel to brand new Christians. He said, "Supposing a man's reason decides that the weight of evidence is for it," meaning the Christian faith, and becomes a Christian, "I can tell that man what is going to happen to him in the next few weeks. There will come a moment when there is bad news, or he's in trouble, or he's living among a lot of other people who do not believe it, and all at once his emotions will rise up and carry out a sort of blitz on his belief. Now, faith is the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted in spite of our change of moods." So how do you do that? You speak reason to your emotions. Once read something from Martin Lloyd-Jones, who wrote about this, and he raised a very important issue. He said, or thought about this, he said, "Have you realized that most of your unhappiness in life is due to the fact that you are listening to yourself instead of talking to yourself? We must talk to ourselves instead of allowing ourselves to talk to us." Which brings us to our final kind of doubt, the one that is birthed from fearing to believe. We talked last week about clinging to doubts because you don't want to let them go. You hide behind them to justify lifestyle choices. You don't want a God in your life, but that's not the only kind of fear when it comes to belief. There's another kind of fear that can generate or keep alive doubts. You can have wounds from believing, wounds from committing, wounds from previous times of trust, and you don't want to be hurt again. So you hide your pain behind the shield of doubt. Augustine once wrote that someone who has experienced a bad doctor, for example, is afraid to trust himself to a good one. And it's a real fear. When I was a boy, when I was in the second grade or so, I was taken to a dentist who found a lot of cavities, a surprising amount of cavities. So that began a series of appointments to take care of these multiple cavities. I think it was like 10 or 12. That was unpleasant enough as a second grader. What made it worse was that, for whatever reason, I was hard to numb. Novocaine worked very slowly with me. So he would begin to drill, and I would feel way more than anyone should. He'd waited whatever the considered to be the appropriate amount of time, but my mouth, I was still feeling everything. And so it was really painful. So multiple cavities, multiple visits, sensitivity to the drilling. It was traumatizing to me. Turns out the dentist was not a good one. He was sued by multiple patients, and he eventually lost his license to practice. We found out that in my case, after going to another dentist, that I probably didn't even have those cavities. He was just saying that to make money or do whatever. That could have made me dentist averse, dooming myself to a life of bad teeth and chronic pain. And there were seasons, particularly in my younger years, where I gave into that, seasons when I didn't take care of my teeth the way that I should. Because even hearing a dentist drill would just affect me. It was just like the worst sound in the world for me. But I learned there were good dentists, caring dentists, sensitive dentists. The dentist I go to now and have for many years is just one of the sweetest people I know. I remember when I first went, she noticed how I was gripping the side of the chair. I wasn't even aware of it, even during a cleaning. And some of the people who worked there kind of had picked up that I was, kind of almost like I was upset to be there. It just wasn't myself. It wasn't acting very normally. And I remember she just stopped and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Can I talk to you alone just a minute?" I never told a dentist my experience in my whole life, but I just sensed I could tell her. So we went into her office and I told her a bit about my story. And she said, "I will so take care of you." And she marked me down as hard to numb, which I am. So whenever I go and have to have work, she gives me lots of Novocaine and lots of time for it to take effect and tests me repeatedly until, they're really is sure that it's taking effect. She offers me nitrous oxide gas to go along with it, which I gladly accept. Whenever we have had to do work, she'll stop every so often along the way and just say, "How are you doing? How are you doing? You need me to stop a little bit? You doing okay?" I could have let a childhood wound keep me from a great dentist. Now think about spiritual wounds. It's okay to have wounds. What's not okay is to not let them heal. I don't know what may have scarred you. It could have been the moral failing of a church leader, a toxic church culture, the misuse of power or authority, greed, financial scandal, narcissism among leaders, entrenched legalism, racism, bigotry, misogyny, churches becoming deeply partisan and aligning themselves with one political party or another. All I know is that if you give in to the fear to believe, then you are inviting doubts to not only stay with you, but to take up residence in a way that they'll never go away. Because in some ways, you don't want them to go away because it's your way of self-protecting. But that's not self-protecting. It's just refusing to heal. And it's refusing to see that there really are some good doctors out there. Jesus helped a lot of people deconstruct from toxic people and cultures, and still does. Just listen to the invitation he gave in his famed Sermon on the Mount. He said, "Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me, work with me, watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly." So there you have the 7 stories of doubt and the reasons why they can take root in your life, but they don't have to. Did you notice that in each and every case, the existence of doubt had more to say about the doubter than the doubt itself, particularly if there was a moment that you embraced the faith and then later were plagued by doubts about it? It wasn't that Christianity really failed the truth test or couldn't stand up under intellectual scrutiny, or that somehow when tough questions were posed or are posed, Jesus and everything he taught just crumbles to the ground. No, doubt often says more about us than the doubt itself. There was something we did or did not do in our faith journey, something we got wrong at the beginning or we got wrong along the way, which means you can do something about it. Beyond just getting answers to your doubts, you can address the root of doubts. Just think of what we've learned. If you have doubt from ingratitude, from losing your memory about your need for God, then remember that first love. If you have doubts born from a faulty view of God, spend time reflecting on God, who he really is. If you have doubt from a weak, undeveloped foundation of faith, shore it up. Get really versed on reasons to believe. If you know you have doubts due to a lack of commitment that may not have been there from the very beginning, choose this day who you will serve, who you will worship. Sign up once and for all. If it became clear to you today that perhaps your doubts stem from a lack of growth, get growing, get back on that bike and start pedaling. If you've let your emotional world run amok, stop listening to yourself and start talking to yourself. And if you're hiding behind doubts because you're afraid to believe, it's time to find healing for those wounds. It's okay to have the scars. It's not okay to live with open, gaping wounds that never, never are healed. You can do all of these things here as part of this community of faith, openly and authentically, with people cheering you on every step of the way. And there's a reason. We have been ensnared by doubt ourselves. But here's what is different about us. We're interacting with our doubt in the light of day, in the context of our faith, in deep belief in and relationship with Jesus. And we have found that you can do that. So join us. Okay. Next week, we've got more to talk about. The most famous story of doubt in the world and how it does not mean what you probably have been told or have heard or think it means. And it holds so many important lessons. I can't wait for us to dive into it together. Until then, let me say a quick prayer for you. Father, we all have doubts, have had doubts, will have doubts. It's a question of just how we engage them and interact with them, and you're big enough for that. And you welcome us getting answers to our questions and seeking out answers to our questions. Father, I just pray that if any of these families of doubt that we walked through today triggered a sense of someone saying, I think there's something behind my doubt that needs to be addressed, then this was time well spent. And I pray that they will address it, Father, as part of their ongoing dynamic relationship with you. I pray that in the name of Jesus. Amen.